So thank you for having me. As Brent mentioned, I used to be a New Yorker. I love this place. It's my soul city, so I'm very excited to be back today to talk to you all. Hopefully have a conversation more than anything. I have observations about what it's like to build for impact versus commercial success. The first being that you get cooler hair. This is my Google headshot. But aside from that fun fact, I think there's just some interesting ways to think about our product muscles differently as we move into the world of social impact. So I'm actually curious, how many people here would consider themselves product managers in the social impact space? Show of hands, clapping, whatever your jam is. Okay, amazing. And then commercial success, I assume, is the balance of everybody, yeah? You're here to build high revenue generating companies and products. Okay, that's good to know. So a little bit about me. Brent gave a little bit of my bio, but I am old. I have been doing product in some way, shape, or form for the last 20 years almost. In big companies and small companies, I've done enterprise software, I've done consumer products, I've had successes, and I've had abysmal failures. And in that time, there came a point where my life took a little bit of a journey, and I decided to become a tourist and really took a tour of curiosity to start working on a political campaign. And that really led to a new phase of thinking for me. It opened my eyes and opened my imagination to the possibilities that all these muscles I'd been building for all these years could actually be useful in a different way. And so that really began the journey to think about what are the properties of working in a space where you are thinking about long-term outcomes and social impact, whether it be economic, civic, political, governmental, science. These are systems that really run our society. What if you're thinking about that instead of thinking about revenue? What are the properties that really distinguish the craft of product when you begin to think that way? So what I'm not here to do is to villainize anyone, right? The good part about this conversation is that we're doing it live. This is not Twitter, so there is space for nuance. I am not here to say that building for commercial success is bad or evil. I did it for a long time. I'm not here to say that it's harder or easier to do one or the other. Not a thing. I'm also not here to say that they're mutually exclusive. There are a lot of the same muscles that I use every day in my work now that I used when I worked at Zaplet or eBay or Google. You can look at companies like Opower, Ben's example from earlier today, where you are successfully doing both. You're helping people think about their energy use, which then helps to address some of the main issues with the climate crisis, as well as building, again, a really successful business that had a $1 billion IPO. So none of these things are black or white. It's not a blue dress or a black dress or a white or a gold dress. We're gonna have nuance today, folks. Nuance. All right, so with that said, there's sort of four things I wanna talk about. I wanna talk about power. I wanna talk about building the conditions for success. I wanna talk about pace, and I wanna talk about how you even measure success in the first place. Reasonable? I also, success for me means that we have Q&A time today, folks. First Q&A and a keynote, we're gonna make it happen. So keep me honest on timing. So first let's talk about power. Who of you think about power today when you are building your products for commercial success? Is that a thing that comes to mind? Some people, a few hands, not many. This is something that's top of mind for me every day when we think about our work in the social impact space. It comes to mind in the small ways when thinking about language. Do we call our partners users? Do we call them customers, or are they partners? Users is such an interesting word. It was really funny. So I get to work at Zuckerberg Initiative right now, and we come from all sorts of different domains. And the first time I slipped up and I was like, yeah, we should make sure that users are, somebody in the room who came from a science biology lab was like, what is a user? Like, you mean like a drug user? No, absolutely not. But just the being confronted with how small things like language position yourself relative to others in a way that makes them feel less than, makes them feel unseen, and makes them feel like they're part of a problem as opposed to part of the solution. So small things like language matter a lot. Bigger things matter too, which is when we think about research and we think about the power of user research. Somebody in the lightning talk talked about do that as early as possible. Yes, do that. But also make sure that you're not just getting in the field observing. One of the observations I have from my work now is that we actually are co-designing. We're not watching, we're not observing, we're including our partners in helping us come up with what the solutions should be in the first place. So again, a subtle shift there from I'm observing the problem, and then I'm going to tell you as the expert what the solutions should be, versus together we are going to experience and try to understand what's happening, and as co-designers with equal power, think about what the answers should be. Subtle, but it makes a difference. The last thing I'll talk about when I think about power is I think about markets, and I think about competition. When I worked at any of the other companies who shall not be named, I was thinking about how do I become number one, right? How do I make sure that my product is the de facto right solution for my customer? That they pick me before they pick alternatives. How do I make sure that I get that 80% market share, not the sort of leftovers? That's really not the sort of paradigm that we have when we're thinking about social impact work. The scale of the problems that we're thinking about are so big and so large, it would be a fool's errand to think that one company and one product is going to make all the solutions and answers possible. So we really think about collaboration. We think about what are you bringing to the table, and what have you been doing before we showed up and decided that we wanted to help out? How can we make sure that the tide lifts all boats, and that we're able to really bring the best of lots of different companies and ideas to solve some of the hardest problems facing our society? So, language, it matters, and it has an effect on the power dynamics. It matters when you think about how you build the solutions. Are you including people, or are you othering them by observing and deciding what the answers should be? And then finally, how are you thinking about collaborative and shared wins? How do those change your frame for how you're thinking about being a product leader? Power. Next thing I want to talk about. I want to talk about conditions for success. So this is a photo of Ellsworth Kelly's building at the University of Texas. Has anybody been here? University of Texas. Okay. University of Texas. It's his only building that he built, and he built it as a place for joy and contemplation. And because of the way that the lights are framed, the light in the room changes throughout the day based on the intensity and the angle of the sun. He really thought about what the conditions were for the folks that would come and visit this exhibit. He was thoughtful about it. He deliberated over it, and this was his only building that he ever crafted in his entire artistic history. He died in 2015. He was 90. He did a lot of stuff. His only building. I say that to say that setting the conditions for success when you're thinking about social impact are equally laborious and require equal attention to detail. When I think about my time on the Hillary Clinton campaign, we wanted to create the conditions for success for the first female president. Obviously, we failed. But there was a lot that went into that, right? It wasn't just the tech products that we were building. It was about the organization we had on the ground. It was about what our narrative was in the media. It was about how we were thinking about voter suppression and what we were doing to tackle all the conditions that would make our ideas come to light and the impact that we wanted to see in the world come to fruition. So in this space, it's often really important to think about what are the public and political wins, and how do they impact how you're thinking about your frame for social impact, right? If you have a lot of people that don't believe in science, it's hard to get people on board for climate change action, which is hard to then make sure that Earth survives, right? So there are conditions you have to create, which is like people have to believe in science again, right? And what do we have to do to create the conditions for that to take hold so that we can then see the outcomes that we want to see as it relates to climate impact? But really thinking about, again, not just the technology, but all the intangibles outside of that has become a really important part of my work, something I never really thought about before. We thought about the whole product. Has everybody read Crossing the Chasm? Old school 90s high-tech marketing book? Okay, I'm really old. Okay. Anyway, read it, it's great. He has in there a concept called the whole product, which is, as I say, this is the idea that you have a core product and you surround it by the different elements that would make sure that the customer value is derived fully from the core product. So an example would be if the core product was a computer, part of the whole product would be then applications. It would be training. It would be distribution and retail. It would be all these things that you surround the core product with to make sure that the value gets delivered to the customer. Well, in a social impact space, we have to think about the conditions even around that whole product. Again, thinking about things like public and political will that make it easier or harder to get the end outcomes that you're looking for. Conditions. Next thing, I want to talk about pace. There's been a lot of great talk today about, well, not talk, but little mentions about agile, right? And making sure that your team is thinking through, again, identifying the problem, doing fast iterations, and getting things to market. Sometimes in the world of social impact, launch and iterate is just not a thing. You have to make sure that at the minimum you're doing no harm. So when we think about our work that we're doing in education and the Zuckerberg initiative, we're trying to educate kids. Imagine if we were launching and iterating on kids and their education. The implications of that are so much damage that we have to actually be thoughtful about it. Yes, we want to make sure that our teams are producing things. Yes, we don't want to be overly unambitious. Yes, we want to make sure that we're actually seeing progress. And we also need to think about what are the longer term implications if we get it wrong. How do we make sure that we're thinking about pace differently so that we're not getting ahead of where we should be in order to make the right set of changes in the world? So pace is another thing we think about a lot. And sometimes you have to go slowly to go quickly. You have to really make sure that, again, as part of your condition setting, you might have to talk to different stakeholders or educate different stakeholders. And that might push your launch out by a year because you have to do a lot of this groundwork in order to create the successful conditions for success and make sure that you're doing no harm in your excitement and eagerness to create impact. So pace is another big thing that we think about and we worry about a lot differently from a commercial versus a social impact space. And the last thing I'll talk about is success. This is a cool photo from one of the walls at Zuckerberg. And we have a bunch of art on the wall. And really, this idea of freedom cannot wait. I think it's a really interesting concept. Freedom cannot wait. If what we are trying to get to is freedom, big words like that, or justice, or equality, or equity, how do you actually measure that, right? So it's not just a simple product analytics problem, which again, in and of itself is a hard problem, right? We talked a little bit about A/B testing. We talked about how do you actually make sure that your product is growing and you have the right adoption, that you're thinking about features in the right way. So all that you still have to do. But at the end of the day, that's not enough. That's a proximal outcome for your long-term goal. Your long-term goal is system change and social impact. So what does it look like? How do you measure freedom? How do you measure power building? How do you measure justice? So a lot of the work that we do is actually not only to think about sort of the core products that we're building, but think about new ways and new methods that we can build in order to measure the outcomes that we're going after. And that's often a hard problem in and of itself. How do you measure things like the pace of science discovery accelerating? I don't know, but we got to figure it out, because otherwise we're not going to know whether we were able to achieve the long-term outcomes that we wanted. But I think here the message is that often we have to unpack near-term proximal outcomes, which can be directionally exciting, and everybody wants to see a launch, and that's wonderful. But the question is, at the end of the day, how did that launch ladder up to long-term system change? And how do you even measure the change in the system that you're going after? And what are you doing today to set the groundwork for that measurement so that you can, in 10, 15, 20 years, look back and draw a through line between the work that you are doing today and the change that you're seeing in 20, 50 years? So, to recap, I think I did great on timing. To recap, thinking about this, observations from the last 5 years of working in social impact. I'd say the first is power. Power dynamics are critical to think through before you start throwing around technology solutions. Then framing and thinking about those power dynamics within the conditions of success, both political and public will. Thinking about how those conditions for success need you to adjust your pace, and to think about what a successful product team feels like and what the accelerated sort of tempo should be for a product team thinking about social impact. And then finally, you might have to get super, super creative and super uncomfortable and start to think about how you even measure some of these more intangible societal changes like progress and justice and equality. So I'll end there and open it up for questions from the audience.
So I have this is a really amazing presentation. I have a quick question. You just ended on, just measuring this tangible success and change within, I guess the outer world. Can you provide maybe some tangible, just kind of examples that you've done, whether at Zuckerberg or at Hillary, just as some guidance for people who are in the space who are facing the same problem?
Yeah. So I think the answer, the question was, could you provide some tangible examples of the intangibles that you've actually measured? Yes. So a good example is, so one of the initiatives that we have at Zuckerberg is an education initiative. And in the education initiative, the core thesis is that we want to build and educate whole children, so that we're thinking about socio-emotional learning, we're thinking about core academics, we're thinking about identity, we're thinking about not just the academics, but also the whole child. So one of the pieces of measurement that we have to do there is, how do we measure that children have established and developed grit? How do you measure that someone started on the platform with grit level A, and after using the platform got to grit level B? A lot of what we do there is working with academic practitioners, right, who have done a lot of research in learning sciences and developed measures and metrics for some of this early work. And so one of the things we try to do is actually be pretty well connected to the academic community, because they are doing a lot of really core research that we can then operationalize and sort of launch at scale. So grit measurement is an example of something that we are looking at as far as impacts around this whole idea of educating the whole child.
When you're working with outcomes that are so large, like freedom and equity, how do you even know where to start? How do you prioritize and break down?
Yeah, so when you're working with outcomes that are so big, like freedom and equity and justice, how do you even know where to start? Well, so I would say that there is a risk of becoming paralyzed by how big that is, right? So we start with the simple things, right? We start with the product analytics pieces. We then work with our data scientists to do lit reviews and to do academic reviews to see who are the thinkers, who are the brightest minds, usually in academia, who are thinking about some of this work already. And how can we, as I mentioned earlier, how can we actually decompose that in a way that it can apply to our work? But I think part of what we are facing is that we don't have the answer for everything, right? So I specifically work in the Justice and Opportunity Initiative, and we're trying to think about how do you actually measure power building in communities of color, right? We don't know. But a lot of what we do is we convene thinkers, and we take an approach that's like, we don't know the answer. It's okay not to know. But we need to make sure that we are bringing the right people and co-creating an answer with them. And we will sort of learn over time, but sometimes we just don't know, and we're still working on a lot of these measures. We don't know.
I wonder if in a space like social justice, do you think about user segmentation differently than you do in the commercial space? Like usually I'm trying to pick like one most valuable customer. Yeah. This is like you almost have an obligation to cross the entire sector.
Yeah, so in a space like, I'm going to just repeat your question, in a space like social justice, do you think about user segmentation differently? Or it might seem like you have an obligation to like serve everyone. And so yes and no. So we do think about segmentation. We actually have a really amazing team in-house, our audience insights team, that actually does think through those things. And mainly to understand what motivates people and what language they are most receptive to when we're talking about some of these issues and ideas. That's helpful as a grounding so that when we are thinking about solutions, one, we're seeking them out in a way that they then respond to us. But that we're also thinking about these segments in terms of how can we prioritize where we think the biggest levers are for change, right? So if we know there's a specific audience that's already on board with science, right? Or we already know that there's a specific group of parents who might already be further along their journey in understanding the value of whole child learning, we can adjust our resources and spend more energy potentially on parent groups and audiences that are maybe not there yet. So we do think about segmentation. It is tempting to say that your audience is everyone, and as you know, it's usually not a great way to sort of slice a problem. So we do use some of those same techniques and some of that thinking. Eventually, again, our tagline is a future for everyone, so eventually we want to get to everyone, but we are sort of thinking about the roadmap in terms of who is aligned and where are our allies and where should we spend more time up front to set the conditions for success. Yeah.
If you were to look back at your career, would you have shifted toward social impact earlier, or do you think you would have repeated your legacy of that?
Question was, if you had to look back at your career, would you have shifted to social impact earlier, or would you have done the thing that you did, which was like 15 years and now 5 years? I think I would have done it earlier, and I think the right answer is to think about it less. I'm in this point where it's now like a new season of my life. I'm now in social impact. I think actually the better model is to sort of go in and out of it, because I think you learn a lot when you are working in the front lines of a commercial business, hard driving, trying to dominate markets, all the things you guys are doing every day. And those muscles have been incredibly valuable to me as I've moved over into this world, but at some point they're going to atrophy. And I think that actually having this cycle of people coming in and out of the social impact space would be great, because I think we'd get the best of both worlds. We get more blended thinking. We get people who are able to identify problems in a different way. So I think it would actually be, I would recommend a different path. And I would have gone back and forth a lot more than just sort of like a block and then a block.
What companies do you look for inspiration, like at that intersection of social impact and product, like beyond Zuckerberg?
Yeah, so the question was, what companies do you look for inspiration who are at that intersection of commercial success and social impact? So this is not going to be a full answer. I'm going to call out some companies I think are amazing. So I am not the first person who's made this switch. You guys might be familiar with an amazing organization called Code for America. It was founded in 2009. They do an incredible amount of work to bring sort of private tech company methodologies, be it design thinking, be it agile, be it iterative launching, to bring those practices to government. I think they're incredible. They're a grantee of ours, a partner of ours, and I look to them a lot for lessons learned. This is also not a direct answer to your question, but I also love the US Digital Service. Is everybody familiar with that? That is another organization that is actually within government. They launched in 2015, 2014, around there. They have created a digital playbook for governments and agencies to start to behave a little bit more like private companies, to make sure that we're being as efficient as possible in delivery of services to constituents. So that's another one. And then I think that the core question about like who is doing the blended sort of set of things, I quite frankly think Stripe is pretty amazing, right? So Stripe, at the end of the day, is a payments processing business that is growing the GDP of the internet and is having a fundamental realignment of molecules as it relates to what are the economies in small businesses and what are they able to do because Stripe has enabled them in different ways. I think that's a system-changing company that also happens to be phenomenally revenue generating.
Deal with sort of defining outcomes that you're tracking in areas where there's a lot of like political disagreement. So an example here would be like privacy versus security or something, right? That's just like a classic example. But there's people who disagree on what the good is there, right? And so, and your user base, if you're thinking about designing things that go across a whole nation, might be people who disagree on what good and bad is. So like, do you sort of shy away from those problem spaces and go towards ones where there's a lot more agreement? Or do you try and parse those things out and figure out what the right balance of outcomes are?
Okay, I'm gonna try to repeat it. So how do you think about problem spaces where the potential customers are potentially polarized about what good or bad looks like? Do you shy away from those things? Do you like go headlong into them? So what I would say is this. I think speaking for Chan Zuckerberg, we are a nonpartisan organization, and we believe actually durable change happens when people can come together across different ideologies and really are centered on values as opposed to sort of political identity. Because that way, those changes become durable, and it's not like as soon as the next set of people come in power, you sort of undo all of the things that the other guys did, right? So that's sort of a core thesis that runs through all of our work, is that we try to find the spaces where there is bipartisan values alignment. So for instance, criminal justice is having this moment where it just so happens to be a bipartisan issue, where there are folks on lots of different sides of the aisle, the business community, the religious community, who are coming together to say this is a system that needs to be rethought. There are cases where we have entered spaces for social impact and the winds have changed. An example being immigration. Immigration used to be, in 2013, 2014, a fairly bipartisan issue where we thought we needed sort of common sense immigration reform, and people across the aisle and of many different ideologies decided that that was a good thing. That has since shifted, and we haven't left the space. And the reason is because system change takes a long time, and abandoning our core values wouldn't allow us to see the durable change. So we're not in it for 5 years, we're not in it for 10 years, we're in it for the long-term change, which might take 20 or 50 years. And so that's the kind of thinking we have. We align on values. We try to find places where people of different persuasions have value alignment, but we know that's not a steady state, and systems are dynamic, and public and political will is dynamic. But knowing if we adhere to those core values as a through line, that's our thesis for how we think we can create durable change long term. So we don't shy away from it, but it happens. All right, I think I'm done. I'm gonna be around if you have questions. Thank you so much.